So we've got a few small clarifications to psychic powers, downloadable index offerings, and army detachments. Let's do a quick overview of Games Workshop's latest 10th edition design interview. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking 10th edition Warhammer 40K once more, where Games Workshop have just published a mini design interview, mostly focusing on their buzzword that 10th edition is going to be simplified but not simple, and a few more hints as to what that means in reality. The interview was only a very short thing, around 6 minutes long. They skimmed over quite a lot of cool concepts just in passing and didn't really go into too much detail, to be honest. And it maybe is just a little bit low yield. A lot of stuff that they have already mentioned at least and we kind of knew was coming, but hidden amongst that there were a few other interesting hints and clarifications, things around psychic powers, the rollout of the indexes, and a few other bits and bobs. It's interesting that Games Workshop's primary selling point of 10th edition rules is they're going to be simpler and easier to play, a lot easier to jump into for newer players, and less to keep track of for slightly more occasional players. Rather than having 10 to 20 of pages of special rules for the army beyond the datasheets, that's generally going to be condensed down to just one or two double-page spreads. To be fair to them, it does absolutely seem to be working. I'm not sure that absolutely everyone will be the biggest fan of losing all of the in-depth army construction things in 9th edition, but for the most part I feel like people are more positive than not, particularly a lot of people who abandoned 8th and 9th edition somewhere along the way due to progressively increasing complexity. It could be at least a little bit of effort just to keep on top of your own army's changes, never mind all the things that were going on for each of the other 20 plus factions in the game. As with 8th and 9th edition, I feel like they're going to quite successfully attract a whole bunch more players jumping back into it to explore the new system. In any case, in their short interview, they went quite quickly over a whole bunch of different topics, some of which would have been quite nice to explore in a bit more detail, but I guess they will do at some stage later on. First up, they touched on stratagems, saying that they'd either primarily be reactions in the opponent's phases, or cool one-off cinematic things. I feel like by omission we might see a bit less that's just random increases to damage or defense for no good reason. I did get the impression when 8th edition came out, stratagems were more aimed to represent one-off command abilities or set pieces, or strategic ploys that your commander could maybe issue to an order to be able to do. I feel like as the codexes have gone on, there's been a lot more of just throwing on random buffs on units, say for example a -1 to wound, a +1 to hit, that kind of thing. To me it just doesn't really make too much sense why you'd shout at your Space Marines to have transhuman physiology this turn, and somehow that squad gets a bit tougher than the rest of them, which also presumably have all the same genetics and stuff. Reactive things do sound quite fun, and I guess if you only had a list of 6 stratagems, your opponent could just read over them pre-game, so it's less gotchery. And the one-off cinematic type things might be trying to get back to how they were originally meant to be, say like triggering a cool bit of war gear to do a teleport shunt across the board, or something like the fire on my position for Imperial Guard, when you request an artillery strike on your own location when you know you're doomed, to try and bring down as many of the enemy as possible when you go. Previously, they've stated that there will be 6 detachment-specific stratagems for your army. They have mentioned the word detachment in this video as well. The core book stratagem will apparently be slightly longer than it is currently. At the moment there's 7 different stratagems there, though a couple of them are a bit redundant and not used much. And they did also say that many things that were previously stratagems could be shifted onto the actual datasheet rules, things like that reactive movement that termagants seem to have. That very much seems like it will be something that will be a stratagem under the current system. They also mentioned the idea that there's going to be fewer big choices before the game. Again, this really smacks of things like the World Eaters style sub-faction detachments, where you choose to say players call World Eaters or their Army of Renown, where you run Angron's Demonic Disciples and get things like different stratagems and different relic choices. It sounds like there's just mainly going to be 2 major decisions for constructing an army, which one of these detachment type things that you choose, who's going to be your warlord, and then from there you can basically play with most of the rules in your army just on the data cards and in that double page spread for the 6 stratagems and then presumably 3 warlord traits and relics if it follows the current trend of this one. They did say in the interview as well that when they decide to add things, it will generally replace these previous rules rather than add on to them. So it sounds like when they do a codex rollout, you'll get a whole bunch of these different detachments, and then you'll be able to choose the one that you go for out of them. So say maybe with Space Marines you might have a Terminator-themed force, or perhaps a Phobos-themed insertion force, and you could choose to run either of those instead of the core Space Marine detachment rules. With this main focus on these detachment things, I'm a bit suspicious that it might mean that things like chapter tactics and equivalents will disappear at least initially. I guess we'll wait and see to that regard. There might well be something that just goes away for the time being and then might come back in the codexes if they do have a section for that and some overarching army rules. Next up, they touched on universal special rules, and I kind of feel like they stole their own thunder on this one by telling us that they were coming back in the FAQ last week. In that brief FAQ, they talked about Deep Strike and Feel No Pain being confirmed. There'll probably be a fair few others, but I do quite like the fact that they've actually gone back to the common parlance names. A whole load of people talk about reserves as Deep Strike and the Ignore Wound saves as Feel No Pain, as they have been in, say, Horus Heresy and in 7th edition and before. I think it's a really good move just to actually move to what the community understands those rules to be, as opposed to try and fight against it and define it as something new and different somehow, as they seem to be trying to do in 8th and 9th. I think it would have been kind of nice if they clarified a few more universal special rules. As I mentioned in a video last week, I suspect things like infiltrate, scout moves, bodyguard abilities, and aircraft rules would all be really quite nice ones to have in the core book, not on datasheets, but I guess we'll wait and see what they come out with. Overall, I think it's very sensible to unify some more common mechanics and reduce variations and mental load on the players. If everyone understands what Deep Strike means and what Feel No Pain means, then it's a whole load less to understand in game if your army doesn't have those mechanics normally. Next up, we had just a little bit more of a hint on psychic powers. They'd already confirmed that the psychic phase is indeed gone, and we know that some powers will be moved onto the command phase, and some might be moved into the attacking phases, so shooting and assault. It'll be interesting to see how that impacts on the numbers of powers that certain psychers can cast and deny. I guess they could probably still have Deny the Witch work fairly similarly. It might just be you can deny a certain number of powers this turn as opposed to this psychic phase. Actually confirming that these are moving on to the data cards is really quite an interesting development, as it kind of has implications for army construction. Currently you draw psychic powers from big tables in the codex, and you might have different ones depending on your chapter or say your Tyrannid Hive Fleet or Genestealer Cult. If the psychic powers are all literally printed on the datasheets for, say, a Space Marine Librarian, it would almost certainly mean that there's probably going to be fewer choices than 6, otherwise you'd have to print out like literally an entire psychic discipline on one tiny data card, which seems a bit unlikely. It'll be interesting to see how much choice psychers get, and whether they just literally come with knowing all the powers in their discipline, or if they still do need to make a pre-game choice, say deciding whether they're selecting, say, a defensive power or a Witchfire perhaps. I feel like in a very similar vein, it would mean things that Chaplain Listeners and the other equivalents out there, like Chaos Space Marine Prayers to the Gods, or the Sisters of Battle Dogmata hymns, I would strongly suspect that they'll also be only on the datasheet as well. I wouldn't be too surprised if things like, say, librarians or those guys all get a choice of 3 powers or something. That might seem a bit more manageable on a datasheet, though it will be a little bit less choice. They've also confirmed that psychic weapons will be a thing. Again, this is something that kind of draws on previous games of 40k or Heresy. They function like shooting attacks, and there might be a way to activate your force weapon in combat if you have one of those. You might need a psychic test to either do a smite equivalent, and then it may or may not have a standard ranged weapon profile, or might still be mortal wounds in some fashion. So far we don't really have any confirmation that mortal wounds are still going to be a thing in 10th edition 40k. I feel like some people wouldn't be too disappointed to see the back of them, or just significantly less in the game. I'd say that personally they're maybe not the worst mechanic in the world though, just to bring a bit of counterbalance against some units getting excessively tanky or Death Starry, and maybe keep the focus on units trading rather than making one super unkillable death blob. Finally, they gave us just a little hint as to the downloadable indexes, again making a big deal that the core rules and indexes will be downloadable for free day 1, perhaps to try and make people feel a little bit better about the Guard or World Eaters codex that they just bought a month or 2 back. They previously said that they'd include Forge World units in this initial offering, and as I talked about previously, I do feel that there's a good chance that there'll be some big no model, no rules changes when they do this datasheet rollout. If your codex wasn't one of the later ones released in 9th edition, there's a good chance that any models that Games Workshop don't directly sell are probably not going to get actual rules for them. It might mean some wargear choices get significantly restricted, or even entire units might be lost along the way if Games Workshop has pulled their resin model. That is the case for a whole bunch of characters at the moment, and even certain units like, say, Drukhari Beasts or Mandrakes might be a little bit worried. Perhaps the biggest actual clarification in this interview is that the documents are still going to be called indexes. You are still going to download Index Space Marines or Index Orcs, I guess. And then they have confirmed that their initial army rules offering will come with a basic detachment to run the army, which I strongly suspect will be the one that they mentioned earlier, 6 stratagems and some warlord traits and relics, which they call enhancements here. So kind of in a way they are going for community demands, having basically every faction's army and codex downloadable and free right from day one, even if they will add in extra content with the actual codexes that come out that you'd have to pay for throughout the edition. I do think that making the rules so easy access and free like this will be a massive win for them. It's going to be so much easier to break down the barriers to entry to Warhammer 40k and not force people to buy quickly outdated index books that have a whole load of stats that wind up being wrong quite quickly as the codexes come out. Then the question is what the codexes might add, and I strongly suspect it'll be those extra detachments that they talked about, and they might add some overarching army rules and things, maybe stuff like Space Marine combat doctrines or chapter tactics possibly, though that's just guessing at this point. Overall, I'd say there's no enormous bombshells from the interview, but there are quite a few actual handy clarifications. Nice to know that we're getting proper detachment rules from those indexes. Interesting that the psychic powers will be on their data sheets, meaning that disciplines as we know them are dead. And a few more interesting hints for stratagems and army construction. Let me know what you make of the hints down in the comments below, and any other interesting implications that I might have missed. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day, and I'm sure we'll have loads more to talk about with 10th. Finally, if you've been enjoying all the videos and updates on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that one linked down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support and keep the videos coming, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.